Dr.
Thank
Miller.
you, Jim, for inviting me here and for the opportunity to speak. My talk is going to be a little more technical than the one before. I think it's going to be based on simple and straightforward logic, but there might be some questions you have at the end, so you know, feel free to think about questions as I'm going along and ask me those questions at the end. Americans have always disliked taxes. The Constitution didn't permit a tax on income, so the income tax we now have required a constitutional amendment. The income tax is one reason why our government is so big and powerful. Nevertheless, there are political limitations on income tax rates. Americans have never allowed the federal government to take more than 20% of their income in federal taxes. Much worse than the income tax is the inflation tax, a hidden tax which can be increased without an act of Congress. The inflation tax is controlled by the Federal Reserve through its decisions about how much to increase the money supply. One of the most important steps that should be taken to return to the kind of limited government and economic freedom that our previous speaker spoke about, and that was envisioned in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, is to abolish the Federal Reserve.
Amen.
My talk is going to be divided into three parts. First, I'm going to discuss how the U.S. monetary system prior to 1913 differed from what we have today. Then I will discuss the Federal Reserve monetary policy during the 20th and 21st century up until now, with an emphasis on what has been happening recently. And last, I will say a little about what the future holds and what you and I might be able to do as citizens and voters, which may not be all that different from what our previous speaker said. Until the early 20th century, our monetary system, like that of most other nations, was based on precious metals, gold or silver. We're now part of a worldwide system of fiat money, which means the government decrees what people must use as money. Fiat money consists primarily of paper money and electronic balance sheet entries. Legal tender laws require everyone to accept fiat money in payment for debt, thus making it difficult for anyone else, for making it difficult to use anything else as money, including bitcoins, the new electronic money. The Constitution doesn't say very much about money or monetary policy. It does make a reference to money in Article 1, Section 10, which reads, "No state shall emit bills of credit." According to Clarence Carson, in an article he wrote for the Freeman, bills of credit was a technical term used at that time to refer to paper that was intended to circulate as money but was not redeemable in gold and silver. The Constitution also speaks about legal tender laws in the same section, stating that no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. Without legal tender laws, which we now have for paper money, people would have the freedom to use whatever form of money others would widely accept, and many would likely not accept unredeemable paper money in times of rapid price inflation, such as we experienced during the 1970s. And anyone who's my age or close to my age probably remembers that inflation. The constitutional provision, that is the two that I mentioned, concerning states, was written during a period when the federal government was weak and some states were issuing unbacked paper money. Its purpose, that is the purpose of this provision, was to restrain the states from inflating the money supply, which they did in response to political pressure from debtors who had difficulty during a period of recession in the mid-1780s. Delegates to the Constitutional Convention were familiar with the severe inflation that occurred during the Revolutionary War, because during the Revolutionary War, Congress and the states issued paper money to help pay for the war. Before and after independence was declared, the Continental Congress issued bills of credit, as did the states. By late 1778, the Continental paper dollar had fallen in value to 25 cents. By 1779, it was nearly worthless, with about 1% of the purchasing power that it had when it was first issued. Except for a relatively brief period of unbacked paper money during the Civil War, from 1789 to 1913, when the Federal Reserve came into existence, the dollar was tied to gold. Because of the gold standard, prices at the end of the 19th century had changed very, very little from what they were at the beginning. Now, I want to move on and talk about money and monetary policy with the Federal Reserve as a central bank. As many of you know, the Federal Reserve came into existence in 1913, and how it came about is a story in itself, which I'm not going to get into. For some years after the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, the dollar continued to be defined in terms of gold. The close connection between the dollar and gold in the U.S. officially ended in 1933 when the government prohibited citizens from owning gold. For exchanges of foreign currency, the price of gold was fixed at $35 per ounce until 1971, when President Nixon ended the commitment to exchange gold for dollars on the foreign exchange market. The previous speaker mentioned 3 things he didn't like about Nixon. Add that number 4, okay? Ending the connection of the dollar to gold, although he only ended what FDR started. In any case, since 1971, the U.S. and every other major country has had a fiat money system. The quantity of fiat money is controlled by the Federal Reserve and banks. Because it costs only a few cents to print each paper bill, and even less to create the electronic checkbook money that we use for most of our transactions, the Federal Reserve can create money without limit and use the money to finance our government's debt. More money in circulation means higher prices, and as government deficits grow, the Federal Reserve has an incentive to fund more of the federal debt with newly created money, which leads to higher price inflation. As a result of Federal Reserve monetary policy, prices today are more than 10 times as high as they were 100 years ago. Although many economists argue that money creation is good for the economy, the new money created by the Federal Reserve benefits primarily those who receive checks from the government and debtors, at the expense of everyone else who must pay the higher prices that usually accompany increases in the stock of money. Price inflation makes it harder for everyone to do the economic calculation that is important for efficient resource allocation. Price inflation acts as a tax on savings. When you put your money in the bank and earn almost no interest, you are losing money every year. With most banks paying little or no interest and an inflation rate of 2% a year, as has recently been the case, you are losing 2% every year on money in savings accounts. In the future, putting your savings elsewhere, such as in the stock market, might not result in a higher return than you're getting from it in the bank. With the government spending more money every year and the inflation rate likely to increase due to Federal Reserve money creation, don't expect the stock market to rise enough to protect you from inflation. Rising inflation usually results in a falling stock market. If money supply growth causes inflation, some of you might ask, well, why have we seen so little price inflation in the last 6 years? Since the Federal Reserve has increased the monetary base 5-fold, from $800 billion to over $4 trillion since 2008. Well, the reason why we haven't seen much price inflation in that time is that the amount of increase in the money supply also depends on bank lending. The Federal Reserve expands the monetary base by purchasing government bonds, and more recently by buying mortgage bonds. When sellers of bonds deposit the newly created money in banks, the banks can expand their loans using the money deposited, thus creating additional money. In the past, banks held only a small fraction of the money originally deposited as bank reserves and lent out the rest. Since they could loan out much more than they held in reserve, the process of creating loans in response to growth in the monetary base led to the money supply growing by considerably more than the amount of government bonds the Federal Reserve purchased. That is in the past, before 2008. Since the 2008 financial crisis, banks have reduced their lending and expanded their reserves, causing an offsetting decrease in the money supply. That is a decrease in the money supply by banks to offset what the Federal Reserve did. So that in fact, since 2008, between 2008 and 2014, the money supply is only about twice as large in 2014 as it was in 2008. Now, I would say that's still too much of an increase, but it's not nearly as bad as the five-fold increase in the monetary base that was brought about by Federal Reserve policy. So, and in fact, our current stagnant economy can be blamed on both Federal Reserve monetary increases in Federal Reserve monetary policy, or the money supply, and decreases in bank lending. So in light of what has happened in the past, what can we expect for the future? Well, if you're paying attention and you see what's coming up, especially with my generation, the baby boom generation, you should have some sense of this. Government debt will likely spiral out of control in the future as more and more members of the baby boom generation retire, and the amount to be paid for Social Security and Medicare far exceeds the revenue the government is collecting for those programs. If you just simply take the current promises for Medicare and Social Security, those programs are going to, in the not too distant future, take half the government. By about 2080, they'll take virtually the total amount that the government now collects in taxes. So, according to the national debt clock, the federal government's debt now exceeds $17.7 trillion. But this is much less than what the government really owes if you count the benefits it has promised to future retirees. If the government counted the cost of Social Security benefits and Medicare coverage using the same accounting standards that businesses are required to use in calculating their assets and liabilities, the total federal debt would be in the vicinity of $100 trillion. Okay, $100 trillion. The government will not be able to raise taxes enough or borrow enough money to pay all of the benefits they have promised to senior citizens in the future, particularly on top of everything else that our government spends its money on. As government spending continues to rise faster than tax revenue, the Federal Reserve will be under pressure to increase the money supply more rapidly than they are now, potentially leading to mass inflation and possibly to hyperinflation. And hyperinflation is defined as inflation rates in the double and triple digits, 50, 100% or more, similar to what as some of you may know, has been experienced in Latin American countries in the not too distant past, and in Zimbabwe only about 3 or 4 years ago. The Federal Reserve acts as if it can spend an unlimited amount of money. The federal government acts as if it can spend an unlimited amount of money, and the Federal Reserve makes it possible for the government to spend more than they collect in taxes or borrow from the public. At some point, either the inflation rate will get too high and voters will get fed up for that reason, or the federal government will default on its debt, perhaps by paying much less Social Security than they promised and drastically reducing what is covered by Medicare. In either case, that will be a chance to get rid of the welfare state as we know it and return to a free market system. So, My talk may sound pessimistic, but I actually believe that as the financial condition of the government gets worse and the government defaults on the promises it made to seniors, people will get fed up with the welfare state. Then, those of us who believe in freedom may have an opportunity to persuade people that a better alternative exists to big government with its regulation. With its regulation, bailouts, and promises of cradle-to-grave financial security. Freedom and free markets have always been a great source of prosperity. Government spending does not bring down poverty rates nearly as well as economic growth made possible by the division of labor in a free market economy. The division of labor is facilitated by stable money and limited government. So, in conclusion, I certainly would agree with what our previous speaker said, but however much people get involved today, I think there's real hope for the future to return to a free market with limited government as our founding fathers envisioned. The power of the government to tax must be restrained. This might be partly accomplished by abolishing the federal income tax. But equally important, if not more important, is that the Federal Reserve be abolished. Amen. So that unelected officials cannot continue to create money by purchasing government debt and thereby tax us with the resulting inflation. The free market will work much better, and government's power will be much more limited if the Federal Reserve is abolished. Thank you.
Professor Tracy Miller. Now, I'm an advocate of individual responsibility because I recognize that liberty and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. We can't have one without the other. And this welfare state has been grown up around us based on false promises, as Dr. Miller was talking about. Now, I believe strongly in protecting ourselves individually in the 5 Gs. Guns, gold, ground, grub. Somebody tell me the 5th one here. And God, yeah, that works too. So I'm kind of curious, Dr. Miller, what would you recommend that the people do? Because the way that the system is set up now, it's very difficult to protect oneself if we were to go into an office of, say, a typical investment advisor who's going to be encouraging us to invest in these paper products that obviously are tied into that same system. What can we do to protect ourselves?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think owning a certain amount of gold makes sense, but the other thing, which again in his 5 Gs, what I would say ground. I have recently begun to invest in rental property because it's not paper. You can get your hands on it, you can control it. It's not going to be affected in the same way by the corruption of the system, by the inflationary monetary policy that paper investments will be affected by. So basically, there's a role for physical gold, and there's a role for owning property. He mentioned ground or rental houses. I think is a way to individually protect yourself. Okay.